Welcome everyone to this Red Table discussion, Redefining Disability in African Context, Inclusion, Accessibility and Legal Empowerment. I'm Julia and I'm volunteer for DEA and I'm honored to guide today's conversation. Before I present our experts, I would like to introduce my co-host, Faith Mango, trustee for DEA, an activist and humanitarian. Her deep understanding of systemic challenges makes her the ideal host for this discussion. Faith?
Hi everybody, I'm Faith Mango. Pleasure to be here and I'm looking forward to hearing such thought-provoking moments from you as we endeavor to make changes and effective changes to Africa and positive, effective changes for people living positively with a disability. Thank you. So before we present our panel, I'd like to introduce a co-host. This is what Julia would have been saying, and that was me. And for decades, I would like to say that Africa has been portrayed as a continent where there is perpetual need for aid. But today we are here witnessing a transformation. And we are here to raise that awareness that Africa is a country that is growing, is prospering, it's got skilled migrants, and actually most of them are prompting a lot of the European communities. Or wherever else that they have gone. And yet, as we celebrate this progress, we must ask, how do we ensure this development is inclusive, especially within our own continent? How do we ensure that everybody is having a pie and a part of the table and is taking part in accessible systems and people are empowered, especially those with disabilities, and that we address the lessons that have been learned from past experiences. To help us unpick these critical questions, we are joined by an incredible panel of experts whose work spans quite widely within disability inclusion, education, law, and community empowerment. Let me introduce them to you.
We have here Dr. Israel Adekunie, a disability advocate and a medical doctor. Nifemi Ajileje, the director of JKS Special Needs Academy. Dr. Diana Msipa, legal scholar and disability rights advocate. Bernard Kariuki, a disability inclusion facilitator, and Moses is a disability rights advocate and acting president of the African Federation of the Hard of Hearing, AFHA.
So we're going to start with the various questions that we have so we can unpick a lot of issues. This is almost like an onion which needs unpicking so we get to an understanding. So with such a wealth of expertise, I'm going to hand over to Julia to carry on with the question.
Number one question we have for Dr. Adekunie. With your expertise in disability inclusion, assistive technology, and humanitarian activity, what role do humanitarian organizations play in supporting inclusive development in African communities today?
Wow. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the warm invitation. This is a very, very big question and it's pregnant with meaning. And just to say this, oftentimes disability within the African continent have been really, really lagging behind in comparison to the global north and also some low and middle income countries. And the reason and rationale are not far-fetched. Poverty remains a major challenge, of course, discrimination, stigma, and the cultural dimension that we have in the continent as a whole. I've been privileged to work in about 16 countries thus far in Africa, both Southern and Eastern Africa and West Africa, and I've seen it all. And as someone with lived experience myself, I realized that the challenges are enormous, but they are not insurmountable. Just to say, I'll start with assistive technology. Assistive technology, by the definition of WHO, of course, it differs by profession, but I'm going to use the health approach for the definition. It talked about the product, the services, and the system that are readily made available to make sure that it is readily available in the continent. Unfortunately, Africa is one of the continent that is lagging behind in this aspect. And like we all know, more than 80% of persons with disability are in low and middle income countries. And for Africa, because we have been plagued by ceaseless wars, if you look at the humanitarian sector, I mean, majority of the wars across the globe are actually in Africa compared to other continents, from South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Nigeria, Chad, West African coast. I think the only place, even Mozambique of late, has also joined the league because I was in Mozambique late last year. So we need to, for us to make sure that assistive technology are readily accessible and affordable for persons with disability, is a complex web that needs systems, that needs legislations, that need policy, and also the need for the voices and choices of persons with disability to be actively involved in the whole process. Oftentimes, people with disability, we are relegated behind the scene and we're not being carried along. And however, the dynamic is changing. Of course, legislation is going across, but with the Convention of the Right of Persons with Disabilities. So the major thing is that we need that political will within the continent to be able to drive this process forward. And unfortunately, a lot of humanitarian actors that have been working in this space, of course, they've also neglected the issue of disability inclusion. Humanitarian actors, it's only of recent that the UN as a whole, which is the overall body, came up with what they call United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. Of course, the African Union came up with its own policy, but implementation has been slow and the commitment and funding is really lagging behind. So what we can do is a holistic approach that will focus on making sure the political will is there, policy are implemented, monitor and track with the active participations of persons with disability across the whole processes. I'll stop here because it's a topic I'm very, very passionate about. Thank you.
That was great answer, very inspiring, and it needs a lot of work. And you see how much everything is related one to another in order for change to happen. And you do so much for it to happen. Thank you. Next question is for Nifemi. Nifemi, you have almost 20 years of experience in empowering children who have disability, like me, and advocating for inclusive education. Could you please say how can Africa's education be restructured to accommodate children that have a disability?
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Good morning, and it's a privilege to be. Well, in Africa, there has been a lot of issues surrounding children with disabilities, especially when it has to do with education. As much as there are so many policies, children with special needs should not be neglected, they should be accepted, they should this. But then we still have a long way to go. A lot is really happening in schools, in the educational system especially. We've had so many situations where those children are accepted, truly they are accepted, but then the right interventions are not provided for them. We've had situations where the children are neglected, where those children face a lot of stigmatization in the school, a lot of discrimination, abuse, and all sorts, even in the school setting, where they are meant to be comfortable, where they are meant to get better, where they are meant to improve. So I think I try to list out some strategies that can be implemented. The first is, I think we need to create awareness, capacity building, training because I realized that sometimes in some schools, they probably have a special needs therapist, probably one or two in some schools, but the rest of the staff, they are not really aware of what disability means, how they need to cater for the child, how the child needs to be managed and all. So I think it's a thing that the whole school needs to be aware, they need to be informed, because even the class teacher in the class, sometimes they don't even know how to manage the child. We have children with diverse forms of disabilities, and a lot of people believe, oh, children who are visually impaired, those who are physically challenged are the ones with disability. Meanwhile, we have some with intellectual disabilities, we have children with autism, we have children with ADHD and all forms of challenges. So I think we need to be really high on informing those people. They need to be educated. They need to know how to manage the children. And then aside from the policies that has been made, I think they should be well implemented as well. There should be some bodies that are going around to implement these rules. It's not about having the rules. It's not about having the policies, but it's about implementing them really. And also, infrastructures should be provided that suits the needs of the child. Children don't learn the same way. Then children with special needs, of course, they need more time compared to the rest of the class. They need other forms of interventions. There should be a difference, as much as they might be using the same curriculum for them, but it should be tailored according to the needs of the child. It should be tailored according to their conditions, to their challenges and all. You cannot give the whole class 10 minutes to solve a question, and you're also giving a child with disability the same 20 minutes. There has to be some sort of management, accommodations and all to suit the child. And then for some of these children in the educational system, they need to be provided with assistive therapy. Aside from what they are being taught in class, I think there should be, in some schools in Nigeria, they actually have some of them like that have a different room for children with special needs, where they are taken to after a while. They work with them. They try to repeat what has been taught in class in order for them to meet up with the rest of the class. And then some of them need some forms of assistive aids for those who have speech issues, for those that are visually impaired and all. So I think materials or technologies or whatever should be put in place for them. And then the environment should be accessible for them. Regardless of the challenge of the child, the toilet should be wheelchair accessible. Some schools have staircases, and the children cannot even have access. We have some children with cerebral palsy who have mobility issues. They don't even have access to go to their classes, except if people are around them to assist and all that. So I think all those should be put in place. And then I mentioned individualized educational plan or program should be designed for them, aside from the regular curriculum. And then there should be inclusion in all areas, aside from putting the child in class with them. But is the child really included? When activities are going on, when programs are going on, the children are going for excursions, do they include those people? Are they included with the rest of the school? So I think all those should be put in place. And then there should be collaborations with, I think there are lots of organizations that are actually working for the progress of children with special needs. So I think schools, educational systems and all can collaborate with these organizations to put things in place. And then there should be proper monitoring, there should be proper implementation, because we've talked about IEP. Some schools actually have IEP. They have some of these things in place. But who follows up on these programs? Who is actually checking if these children are getting the support that they need? There should be a review, either weekly or monthly, to check the progress of the child, to review the IEPs, to check if the child is actually following. Because we discovered that in a lot of cases, some children are just kept in schools they're just there. They're not learning anything. In fact, some of them even regress. The things that they've thought they've learned before, they tend to regress because they're not really getting the interventions they need. So I think some bodies or some people should be available to monitor the progress of these children. Their IEPs are checked, their reports are checked, they are checking if there's actually progress going on. Thank you very much.
Nifemi, I wanted to say that you can see that it's your pain, that you're dealing with it every day, you're witnessing all these challenges, and you are a big human. Me myself, I had ADHD, and then now I have issues with the speech simply because back then there was no education about children that are different, and then you get the fear, you get all these anxieties related. We go next, Dr. Msipa. With your expertise in disability rights law, legal empowerment, and your expertise in the African human rights, how can Africa's legal framework be improved? How can Africa's legal framework be improved to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities?
Thank you so much, Julia, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone else. So I think answering this question requires me to kind of take a step back before discussing how Africa's legal frameworks can be improved, to try and take a look at what are the shortcomings of African legal frameworks. So I'm taking this from the domestic law. So when we speak about legal frameworks, there's various levels. So there's the domestic levels, which is the laws at national level, the laws that each country, each African country has. And then there is the regional legal frameworks, which are the laws or the instruments that are made under the auspices of the African Union. So these apply to the region as a whole. So I'm going to discuss, I think, the shortcomings of domestic laws on disability rights in Africa. It's difficult to generalize, because each country will have different laws, but there's certain shortcomings that tend to be recurrent, that are a recurring theme in a lot of domestic laws in the region. So overall, I think at domestic level, there is a weak legislative framework in relation to disability rights. One of the main issues is the fact that many of the laws are adopt what we would call an outdated approach to disability. What do I mean by this? I mean that most of the laws look at disability as a medical issue and a welfare issue. So in other words, these frameworks look at disability using a medical model of disability or a welfare model of disability. So you will find that many of these laws have and too much of an emphasis on rehabilitation. And while that is necessary, it is not, it's providing rehabilitation alone is not equal to providing or upholding the rights of persons with disabilities. And then the second shortcoming, which is closely related to the issue of approach, of an inadequate approach to disability, is the fact that many of these legislation don't deal with the various rights. So because they look at disability as a medical issue, as a welfare issue, there's a lot to do. They address a lot of rehabilitation issues, a lot of medical issues. They address a lot of help and assistance issues, receiving welfare from the states, et cetera, et cetera. And while that is important, as I said, it is not the only thing that needs to be done in order to ensure that persons with disabilities are included fully in our societies. So what you find in a lot of the legislation is that there is a complete absence of rights that are essential for the full and effective inclusion in society of persons with disabilities. So here I'm talking about rights such as the right to access justice. That is an important one because we all know that once you can't access a particular right that you have, say the right to education, then you will need to, enforce it perhaps through the justice system. So without that right to access justice, without systems in place to ensure that persons with disabilities can participate effectively in the justice system, then you have essentially a right that exists only on paper, but cannot be enforced through legal mechanisms. So you find rights, another right which is very important, but is also missing from a lot of the domestic legislation on the rights of persons with disabilities, is the right to live independently in the community, the right the right to legal capacity, the right for persons with disabilities to hold rights, and to act in order to exercise those rights. So at domestic level, you will find, for example, legislation that says an adult with, let's say, an intellectual disability has to have a legal guardian that makes their decisions, whether it's medical decisions, financial decisions, decisions relating to property, etc., etc. So that is an issue of the lack of recognition of the right to legal capacity. So issues around the right to work as well. The right to work is generally not provided for. The right to participate in public and political life, that means voting, ability to stand for election to public office, etc., etc. So without these rights, these are just some of the examples which I think are key rights for the inclusion and effective participation in society of all persons with disabilities. But what you have is a scenario where the bulk of the domestic legislation on persons with disabilities on the African continent does not include these rights, but tackles disability rather from a medical and welfare approach. So that is, I think, in a nutshell, in a very simple terms, some of the shortcomings of the legislative framework at domestic level. So I will move now to how do we improve these legal frameworks. So I think one of the main issues is to domesticate regional instruments. If you recall, when I started this, I differentiated between domestic legislation as well as regional instruments. So at regional level, at African Union level, there are international human rights instruments. The most specific one for persons with disabilities has a long name. It's called the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Africa. It's a long name. So in short, we just generally refer to it as the African Disability Protocol. So why I'm saying that the domestication of the African Disability Protocol is an important part of improving African legal frameworks at domestic level is this. One of the key things that the African Disability Protocol does is that it provides a shift from a medical way of looking at disability to a social model way of looking at disability. What do I mean by this? It's about understanding disability not just as the result of someone's impairment, but the result of the interaction between that impairment as well as societal factors. So in other words, this approach to disability recognizes that external environments, societal barriers can actually be part of the problem that contributes to further disabling persons with disabilities and disadvantaging them generally in society. So there's a shift that the African Disability Protocol brings about in the approaches to disability, which is very important. So it emphasizes that disability is a social issue. It is not just the problem of someone having an impairment, but it is also about society. And the importance of recognizing this is that if we recognize society as part of the problem, then automatically society must be also part of the solution. So we now come up with interventions to problems that don't only look at trying to fix the individual with disability, but also trying to address the issues or the barriers that are within society. The previous speaker spoke about the provision of reasonable adjustments, reasonable accommodations, perhaps in the school setting. So that is about looking at that is a manifestation of the social model of disability because it's talking about making adjustments to the environment. So therefore, there's an implicit recognition of the fact that the environment is part of the problem. And then a second reason why I say, this is the last one, why I say that the domestication of the African Disability Protocol could be one of the important keys to creating a more inclusive legislative framework on the continent is because the protocol takes a leaf from the other disability-specific instrument at global level, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It takes a leaf in that it includes a lot of the rights that you would find in the CRPD. But then what it does, it takes a step further and then reframes those rights in a manner that includes or takes or reflects the lived realities of persons with disabilities in Africa. Let me explain. So, for example, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities provides for the right to legal capacity in its Article 13. The African Disability Protocol does the same. It provides in Article 13 as well for the right to access justice. But the way that the right to access justice is framed in the African Disability Protocol is slightly different from the way it is framed in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. One of the most important differences between the framing is in the idea of the inclusion of cultural legal systems or traditional legal systems. So we all know that on the African continent, there is civil law systems that we are aware of, that we all are familiar with. But alongside that, there's traditional forms of justice where people go to traditional courts, they go to chiefs, and it's a recognized form of legal systems. So the African Disability Protocol recognizes that there's this parallel justice system that exists alongside the civil legal system. And so that's one of the ways, for the sake of time, I can't give you many examples of how the African Disability Protocol not only contains a list of rights, but frames these rights in such a way that they reflect the lived experience and the lived realities of persons with disabilities on the continent. So in short, or in summary, to how to improve the legal frameworks in Africa, I think one of the most important ways is to domesticate the African Disability Protocol in a uniform manner. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masipa, for that in-depth explanation and unpicking the legal issues, and especially pointing out that it's not for lack of legislation and the letter of the law. It's probably more around the spirit of it and how it is therefore applied within our social context, and how we ourselves are to perceive it, enabled to actually make it apply effectively. You explained it in more detail than I have done there, and I shall stop there because I don't want to dewater everything that you have said. And I will go to Bernard. Bernard, who's an expert in disability inclusion and facilitation and accessibility assessments and community transformation. Bernard, then my question for you is this. What are the most significant barriers to accessibility in African communities, and how can these be addressed? Maybe in the interest of time, if you could combine this with how can disability inclusion be integrated into community development projects across Africa? Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you very much, Faith. Good afternoon, and also good morning to wherever you are. I appreciate for this session, and I also acknowledge the submission that has been done by the rest of the panelists. I hope I'm very clear.
Yes, you are, Bernard.
Thank you, beautiful. When you talk of the issue of accessibility in terms of disability inclusion, many may tend to think of the physical mobility aspect of it. But when you derive the target from the legal framework, actually, according to me, accessibility can be a means to an end and an end to itself for disability inclusion. Because accessibility means whatever that we do, the physical environment, the communication, the means of transport, the technology, how accessible is it to persons with disability? And those are the key or pertinent questions that we need to ask ourselves when we are answering the issue of accessibility. But when it comes down to Africa, we have so many barriers that do challenge the aspect of accessibility, but I'll narrow down to only three. One, it is the attitude of the human being. They have negative attitude toward persons with disability, and you realize that whenever they are constructing, be it public spaces, be it buildings, be it issues to do with communication model and channels, they don't consider the aspect of accessibility because to them, they don't think persons with disability have the right to those all aspects of life. And so if our humanity can change the negative attitude they have to a more positive and welcoming attitude, then we'll be able to change this slowly. Another angle I look to it is the policy aspect. My predecessor panelists talked about the legal framework we have. Yes, we have good framework and documents. Recently, 2018, that's the time we adopted the African Disability Protocol. And it is very, very, very relevant to the African context. And that's why it is a best document that Africa countries can adopt so that to go to the next level in terms of disability inclusion. And so we need to look into our policies. How inclusive are they? To what extent do they embrace the issues of personal disability? But having said that, yes, we may be having the nice document that you're talking about, but if we don't have the political goodwill from our leaders, such that once the state parties adopt and ratify those documents, that they put in structures and instruments to operationalize those documents, then we are not going anywhere. And on top of this, we need to allocate resources because, again, even if we want to do some issues, some activities to promote the right of personal disability, it will call for resource allocation. And this calls for our political leadership. Do they ever consider allocating adequate resources in terms of budgets so that implementation on the same is possible? Another angle I want to take this issue is angle of participation, including persons with disability, including through their representative organization. You realize that over time, people have been talking on behalf of persons with disability. Organizations are for, not of, persons with disability. And so until the time we start involving, letting the persons with disability to voice their issues, then we may drag behind in realizing some of these benefits that we have in terms of the right of personal disability. And this is very clear, even in the legal document, CRPD, Article 4, under the general obligation, that if a focus work was to be done, then we need to engage and involve personal disability and also their representative organization. The question on how to integrate disability inclusive in the development, that is community development. One, we need to sensitize the community and also the government about the disability inclusive concept because it is something new and it got more weight come the year 2018 when we had the first disability, that is Global Disability Summit in UK. That's when we started hearing about inclusive programming, universal design. That's the time we started yelling about issues to do with nothing about us without us. And so we need to make people understand the aspect or concept of disability inclusive, such that it is considered from designing stage of anything. So that if you want to do a program, consider disability inclusive from the beginning to the closure of the project. And if you are around me, if you remember Sustainable Development Goals, for my own view, if we were to embrace disability inclusion as an approach that will bring about meaningful and impactful development in our community, then we are assured of achieving the SDGs. But without this, believe me, we are going nowhere. Simply because majority of the key players in the area of disability inclusion, what they are doing is they are just doing it as a performance aspect, not an issue of practicing. And that's why you realize that we are just checking the list, just ticking the points. But when it comes to practicing, it is not being done, including organizations that purport to be working for persons with disability. And so, Faith and the panelists, if you were to progress in terms of implementing and realizing the right of persons with disability, one, let them be involved, let them give their views, let them be put on the decision table so that they are able to air out. They know their challenges, they know their needs, as well as they have the solution to the challenges. And this is what affirms the common we're saying that only the wearer of the shoes that does know where it pinches most. Thank you very much. Back to you, Faith.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for closing up with that very powerful statement. And what I'm getting here is that you are really putting forward that people with disabilities need to be at the table, cutting the pie, not just being given the pie. And because they are actually expert by experience. And I think that is my take home from what you're saying. Thank you so much. Now I move on, lastly, by no means least, to Moses. Moses is an expert in hearing disability inclusion, safe listening practices, and I hope I've been listening very well, human rights and accessibility. Now, Moses, you have the job here to talk to us and tell us about how can safe listening advocacy campaigns be scaled across the continent to prevent hearing loss? And with that, if you could also talk about what role do organizations like AFHO and the World Hearing Forum play in creating more inclusive Africa for hearing? So basically, what do organizations such as these do to put forward the issues of inclusion, particularly around the hearing and the hearing loss? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be part of this call. And I'm Moses. And to start with the Safe Listening campaign, that is something that we have been doing. A member of the World Hearing Forum Steering Committee, and I'm a safe listening advocate. So safe listening is all about ensuring that many people are not falling victims of hearing loss. So we do advocate and inform people about safe listening practices. Like me personally, I use my lived experience. I used to be using earphones in my ears, and they incapacitated my hearing ability. So because my hearing ability degenerated because I was using earphones, it prompted me to go into the change-making journey to show people that practically hearing loss is very, very possible if you don't put everything into practice. So for the last 16 years, I have been struggling with hearing loss, and I have just come to adapt. Just 4 or 5 years back is when I started adapting to it, and then I have been using my network very well to see that I connect with people who are like-minded people who are promoting ear and hearing health care and advocating for people like us, people who are not deaf, but we are struggling to hear. We have always been excluded in the development initiatives. For example, all the interventions that are being implemented in disability, they are looking at including persons who are deaf if it comes to the hearing impairment. All the interventions are looking at deaf people, and now we have all been forced to follow the direction of acting to be deaf in the sense that we need to be supported. But sometimes we find that being packaged as deaf people is somehow not doing so well with us. And because we have different abilities and there also the deaf culture, we find ourselves not able to fit into the deaf culture, and that one alone makes us to come out and then speak loudly about the real issues that we are facing and how people can be supportive of people who are hard of hearing. So when you look at the hearing loss situation in the African context, it is so high. Recently, the World Health Organization released the status report on hearing loss in Africa, and if I'm not forgetting, it was estimated to be 360. It was estimated to be 360 million people who are struggling with hearing loss in Africa. So when you look at the increasing cases of hearing loss, there is need for us to do something. Hearing health has always been excluded, or it has not been considered in many situations. Sometimes you find that more people or more organizations are supporting the blind or the side projects, but nothing has been said on ear and hearing health care. As such, more people are becoming more hard of hearing. They are losing their hearing, and it is estimated that the number is going to be increasing and increasing on a daily basis. So, as the president for the African Federation for the Hard of Hearing, we have been encouraging our members from different countries to be speaking about the concept of hearing loss in their communities and to promote the message of safe listening, because many youth and children are victims of safe listening bad practices. And when hearing loss has occurred, it is always irreversible. And now it is indirectly contributing to the number of disability prevalence in Africa, especially that one that relates to hearing loss. So when you look at the number of organizations, people who are hard of hearing in Africa, they are very few. Before, all the energy has been put on deaf people, and we have realized that deaf people are there and we are also there. But for example, this year in Uganda, we advocated for disaggregating data for hard of hearing and deaf people. Now, to our surprise, it is not even surprise to us who know hard of hearing people are very high. They are 3 times or 4 times bigger than the number of people who are deaf. And most of the times they have been ignoring the issues that we have been telling them. They have always been only focusing on sign language. But sign language alone does not define the challenges that people with different hearing abilities experience and what they actually need as an intervention.
Thank you very much, Moses, for that very passionately presented piece of discussion. And I think what you are saying here resonates with quite a lot of people, where certain types of disabilities are either aggregated to a bottom shelf or a lesser relationship, or not quite given the credence and the recognition that it should be, so that effective changes can actually be made. But it is with people as passionate as yourself, continuing to speak out even louder and loudly, that these things can be put to the fore, and that legislators, policymakers, and leaders and community leaders, and even at ground level, that these issues can be heard. And tagging on what you have said, we did put we announced our podcast on the DARE social media, and we received some questions, and some of these questions the ones that have already been answered, I'm not going to repeat, but I'm going to pick 2 or 3 from here, and any member of the panel might well wish to respond to these questions, so probably respond in short. And I don't know how much you have engaged with the African diaspora, or in your visits to Europe, or wherever else you have been for such other forums, but how do you think the African diaspora skills and resources can be leveraged then to promote inclusion for people with disabilities?
I would start by saying that the diaspora relations, there is the element that the diaspora, or people from those countries, are the ones who define the terms and conditions on what, like if they are to give the fund, what the funds they are repatriating can do. And this can include being allocated to promoting disability inclusion or anything outside disability. So in my view, I think it is important that there is greater investment in the area of disability inclusion. And when I go to the skills and resources, I'm looking at how we can be having exchange programs. Exchange programs, of course, can help to enlighten us as neighbors from the African region. Our neighbors here have been speaking loudly about the African Disability Protocol, but again, we also have the national laws even before trying to go into what is connecting us as Africa. We also need to strengthen the national laws that actually give us meaning to speak in the context of the African United context, like that one for the African Disability Protocol. It is very, very important. Now, strengthening the national component first in disability inclusion, it is something that we need, like adopting best practices from the diaspora. We have been seeing what is being done in the diaspora, and practically how can it be done into our national context. The applicability of what we see or we hear or we learn from the diaspora, something that we can easily relate to our national context to help us drive the message of change and inclusion for people with disabilities. These are skills that we actually need, like people from the diaspora. We also need to work in collaboration with them, like to have a standard way of doing monitoring and evaluation of our engagements, to see to it that there are some things that we can do together strategically, and then we can monitor them strategically, especially those ones that relate to national laws and policies that support disability inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who may want to speak to this point before I go to the next one? Thank you very much, Moses.
Yes, thank you so much, Moses, for that fabulous answer. Just to add to it, of course, the diaspora component, you have two major people, the migrants from Africa and also probably the donor country. And I'm currently based in London. I'm a PhD student at University College London. In my engagement with alumni and also other people of African descent, I've learned to work with them to change their perspective about disability. Oftentimes, they see disability from the charity approach rather than the human right or the social model, as the case might be. So in my engagement, one of the things I've been able to do is to engage with them on a regular basis, raise awareness on the need for them to change their perspective. And this has really been of great importance right here in the UK, where I currently live. and I'm studying. Additionally, I've also engaged with donors. I remember last year I was in Germany at the World Health Summit, where I had the opportunity of meeting with the Minister of State and to advocate on the need for them to increase funding within the development aid budget. Of course, there's this 0.5 ODA assistance to development in low and middle income countries, on the need for them to increase it, and also to ensure that disability issues are captured. Additionally, the need for data, which is another major thing that we are lagging in our continent, of course, disaggregation of data by disability type, to see that as every segment within the disability community have access to resources. Going back to the resources within the African continent as a whole, one thing I'll tell you, based on my work, unfortunately I work in Uganda too, is that Africans, we lack the skill set in comparison to the global north across multiple areas. However, we have the resources. Unfortunately, I see resources in both the private sector and the public sector. I remember the work we did when I was working with CBM back home in Nigeria several years ago, how we were able to secure some funding to advocate, to support legislation, and to also build the capacity of organization of persons with disabilities to have an understanding of their right, how to go about it, the strategy that they needed to do. And that led to a lot of significant changes in the country. We have legislation passed, we have policy developed, and we have domestication of the policy. And now what we are trying to make sure is to ensure that the government in itself make it a priority to budget for inclusion. Because no matter the legislation, no matter what you say, if there is no budget, it's like a waste of time. We know within the NHS system, within the UK system, you see a lot of budget being allocated to issues of disability, including reasonable accommodation. So these are some of the things that we can leverage on further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Israel. And Bernard, I think you want to speak to this point before we quickly move on to the next one.
Yes, precisely, Faith, and thank you for the opportunity. When we talk of skills, my view is that as African, for us to tap into the skills in the diaspora, we need to come together and think around of maybe forming a network that will see how these skills can be transferred into Africa. Then we need to borrow the best practices that are contextually relevant to African, because remember, in Africa, probably we don't have even the advanced technology. And so we need to bring those skills that we feel that they are contextually relevant, that can be adopted so that we are able to push the issues of personal disability forward. When we come to resources, the issue of resources is not a big challenge, but the management and allocation of resources is the issue, because most of the resources you find goes to waste. For example, because of the challenge of corruption, duplication of intervention. And so through the same either umbrella or network that we may think of forming, or which is there, maybe African Disability Network Forum and the like, we should be able to come with very, very relevant, effective, and efficient strategies on how to tap in those resources available, then allocate the resources to the most felt need of the community of the person with disability. And to summarize, as my brother have said, let the person with disability be at the forefront in this fight, so that we are able to deal with the actual or the real issues, such that we don't again misuse resources to non-issues. And that's my submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a submission. It makes me wonder, though, I suppose what we are saying is that there has to be such willpower to make these changes. It makes me wonder how somehow I saw a car back in Africa, which could be more than 50 years old. All its parts are almost falling off, and yet that car is moving. How is it we can't do the same for simple things like wheelchairs or things that are required, or beds or adoptive beds and things like that? They don't need to even be very technologically advanced. I think we can do it, but what you're saying here is a lot of knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, and then adaptation to our own communities in the context of the resources that are available. Thank you very much for that. In the interest of time, I can see that we're really urging to the end. So I'm probably going to ask the last question and ask the other participants if they may wish to answer. How do we see the role of faith-based community in the advancing of disability inclusion across the continent? Because we do know that we have a very strong ethos within the faith-based communities, whatever they may be. But what is their role? Because they are very pivotal in shaping society. And if we are saying that the social model of disability is the one that needs to be pushed forward, this is the area. So what do you think is the role of faith-based communities?
Fortunately, I work with faith-based organizations in time past, and they actually have a critical role to play, and they've been playing it. I remember I work with CBM, which is a Christian-based organization based in Germany, Christopher Blinding Mission. And one of the things they were able to do over the years, at first it was more of a charity approach, but now they've adopted the human rights-based approach to disability inclusion. And through that, because CBM modulus operandi is to walk through churches, okay, in every country, churches, government, and institutions. So they've been able to like strengthen that. And I see that being translated across most African countries where they work. However, I would say the faith-based organization, because Africa is a very religious continent, I must confess, there is need for us to like engage, we organization of person with disability, individual with disability, to engage with the religious leaders, the traditional leaders, towards changing their perception from the charity model, because the majority of the faith-based looks at disability from the charity approach. What can we give them? How can we be of help to them? We need to change their perspective to ensure that they adopt the human rights-based approach to disability inclusion. Thank you.
So I just want to share some of the work. So I work with the Center for Human Rights, which is a research institute that is part of the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And in recent years, I think the past 4 years, we've been working with a number of other universities on a project that is around persons with albinism, and that has involved a faith aspect. So one of the main issues in terms of albinism or persons with albinism was the issues of myths and misconceptions about albinism, particularly the belief that persons with albinism are lucky charms, and then if you use the body parts of persons with albinism for ritual purposes, you're likely to become wealthy. So one of the things that we did as part of this project was to engage faith organizations in the sense of traditional leaders, who are the ones that generally perpetuate this particular misconception, and it has had very seriously harmful effects. There's been a lot of abductions and killings of persons with albinism because of that issue. So we've engaged them to explain to them, that albinism is a medical condition.
Sorry, Jan, what has been the response to your engagement, if I may ask?
I think it's been mixed. There's people who've been willing to engage. There's people who've been unwilling to engage, and there's people who engage on a superficial level. And then there's also people who were like, oh, okay, will think about it, you know. So I think we've started, what I can say is that we've started the conversation. Whether or not we've made an impact or managed to change their minds about albinism, that's something else I think that we are yet to see over time. But I think what we are grateful for is the opportunity that we've had with those that were willing to engage, to sit down and have a dialogue and explain, and have also some persons with albinism explain, you know, the trauma that they've gone through because they've been mutilated because of the belief or this misconception that has been perpetuated. So I think, you know, faith is an important part of our community as Africans, of our culture as Africans. And I think whatever we do in terms of promoting the rights of persons with disabilities, we need to include faith-based organizations, including people like traditional healers. So I think in terms of my closing remarks, what I'd like to say is just emphasize the importance of having an enabling legal framework, such as the African Disability Protocol. The protocol is now in force. It needed 15 ratifications in order for it to come into force. It's now in force. It has received the requisite 15 ratifications. But if we're to make an impact on the African continent, we need universal ratification. So we need all 55 AU member states to ratify the African Disability Protocol. And I think my sort of closing remarks is, again, a clarion call to ask all of you in the spaces in which you work, you know, to speak about the African Disability Protocol as much as you can, because once we have an enabling legal framework, then the next step is talking about implementation. But we all need to have that enabling legal framework. Thank you, Faith.
The issue of religion or faith-based organization is very pertinent and very key in terms of disability inclusion. But again, it is very challenging depending on the narrative that is going around in the faith-based institution. For instance, you realize that many people with a disability go to these religious gatherings, maybe with a goal to get healed or a miracle to happen. Others, like Bernard, would not go because I fear to be healed due to the benefit that comes with the disability. And so if the narrative around the faith institution is not positive, is not that promote inclusion, then it means the battle will be very far away from being fought or won. I remember there's a church I engaged here in Kenya, in Nairobi. And after our engagement, finally, they were able to embrace disability inclusion to the extent of allocating one Sunday in a year to be a Sunday to create awareness, even setting aside a budget for the same. And for them, they don't call people to be prayed for a miracle. Rather, they pray for people to go to heaven at some point. And so the narrative that miracles is what will be needed by person with disability is misplaced. Because if the miracle does not happen, does it mean that I will not be operational? No. If the miracle does not happen, does it mean that I will not be in need of feeding? No. And so we need to train the church leaders, clergies, and the like on issues of social model of disability inclusion, so that now the perception changes from the spiritual way of thinking that this is a curse, this is a demon, and it needs to be cast out for the person to be whole again. So I think that is the angle to take, and if we do that, we'll be headed in the right direction. My closing remark, as Dr. Msipa has said, let all of us at our own level and possession or area of influence preach this good gospel of disability inclusion, that we all need each other and we need an inclusive society for us to live in harmony. Thank you very much. Back to you, Faith.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And talking about what you said about the church, I think this echoes something that was already said by Nefe before around accessibility. You will find people wanting to come to a church but can't even go there, especially if they've got a wheelchair or if there are stairs, and they can't even get to the altar, which is the space in which they are being told to actually come and get prayed for, where people who may be hard of hearing cannot even hear what is being said. There is a PowerPoint projector which can't be seen from the back. And therefore that is very excluding. Now, at the risk of taking over, I am going to pass over to Moses.
Thank you so much. I just want to emphasize that community-based organizations and faith-based organizations have a responsibility to promote social inclusion at the grassroots. And looking at disability, we need to empower people to understand the concept of disability, to accessibility, physical accessibility, and information accessibility are very crucial in the services that are being promoted in faith-based organizations that can support or promote disability awareness and disability inclusion. Thank you so much. And my closing remarks simply would be for us to promote disability inclusion in the African context, there is need to have intentional, inclusive programming and budgeting. If we put these ones into consideration, as well as supporting capacity building, because this is something that has been leading many people, putting them behind. So if we put more emphasis on investment and budgeting inclusively, we shall be able to promote disability inclusion. And lastly, safe listening is something that I would like to ask you to join me and promote it, because all of us are victims. I understand many of you may be using earphones or headsets unknowingly. So safe listening is something that we all need to embrace, and let us not be victims of hard of hearing people, because the World Health Organization has already anticipated that the number of people who are going to be having hearing loss by 2030 is going to be increasing. So let me hope you are not going to be part of the projected increase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moses, for that. I think what you're saying here is we all part of the octopus. Without all its legs, an octopus cannot operate effectively. And this is indeed where each and every one of us has to make an impact in our spheres of influence.